Hello and welcome back. sleepywhatsit here with another miniatures video for you. In today's video, we're going to be going through a paint-along tutorial of a Stormcast Vindicator, focusing on just using the supplies that you get in the new GW Stormcast Vindicator and plus paint set. I'll be discussing in the later portion of this video some refinements that you can make to this paint scheme if you have, like, for example, the Gut Ripper in paint set or the Age of Sigmar paints and tools set, but the core paint job is going to be based around only the paints you get in that box. If you've not seen one of my paint-alongs before, welcome, and I hope that you'll find this useful. I try to structure these around how I would teach someone in person during a painting session, so I try to break it down step by step, showing you what I'm doing and explaining why I'm doing it. I'm targeting this at new painters, so I'm going to try and limit the number of different techniques that I'm using, and just try and explain them when I use them, so no crazy wet blending or anything like that going on here. I'm also going to give you some pause points at various times of the video to go complete the steps that I just described. The markers for these points are going to look something like this. I'm not going to do an in-depth tutorial on how to assemble and prep your minis. I've done a couple of videos on how to assemble GW Monopose minis previously. I'll link down below and throw a card up for if you need some guidance in that area. The other thing that we need to address before we actually get into painting is that there is no primer or other undercoat supplied with this kit. You can paint hard polystyrene miniatures like we have here directly with acrylic paints, but the paint isn't going to adhere particularly well to it because acrylic adheres to acrylic better than it does to polystyrene. This means that it'll be prone to rubbing off after while you're painting, and then even once it's completely cured, it's going to have a tendency to wear faster from handling while playing games. So the solution to this is to apply a primer on our miniature before we start, but as I said before, we're not provided one. I do really highly recommend you prime your minis before painting them, even so much to go get some primer for this kit, because I do that for all my minis. I've created an entire video discussing the basics of priming your minis that you can go check out before you start, so I'm not going to dive too much into it here. For this model, since there are some people that may be painting it with theirs unprimed, because they're just trying to figure out if miniature painting is for them, I've primed my model a mid-tone gray that looks approximately the same color as the underlying plastic. This is so that you can see things like how thin one coat goes on and how it doesn't completely cover things, but I still want that primer there so that for my own preservation of the paint job, it's not going to wear off. If you need to, you can pause the video now and go assemble and prepare your models as needed. Before we get into actually painting, let's discuss how to prepare your paint on the palette, since I'm assuming you're a beginner. There's a natural tendency to just kind of try and use paint straight out of the pot. I admit fully, when I was a youngster, that's exactly what I did, and it didn't turn out so well. But so this is a tendency that you really should resist. This is because Citadel paints, and most acrylic paints in general, are thick out of the bottle, relatively speaking. So getting a smooth layer down on your model straight from the pot is actually quite difficult. As hopefully you can see here with this Abaddon Black, straight from the pot, the paint tends to hold its shape significantly and isn't like naturally leveling out. So when you paint with this on your model, when it's this thick, it's going to be prone to leaving kind of like little ridges in the paint so you can actually see the stroke of the brush. And it can be even worse than that because this thick paint can really clog up the details of your sculpt if you're not careful. The fix for this is to thin down your paint by mixing in a little bit of water into it before you actually start using it. This is because acrylic paint is water soluble, so that's awesome. No nasty paint thinners that you have to use here. Just standard tap water will work fine. You don't have to add too much water, just enough so the paint is kind of like flattening out. Like, you don't want it like flowing as you tip the palette. You just want it kind of not holding like a peak. When the paint is this consistency, it's going to probably look a touch streaky when you lay it down when you're doing your base coating, which is fine. It just means that you need to apply 2 thin coats to get complete coverage. But because we're thinning our paint, it should dry faster, so you shouldn't be adding too much more time to be doing it this way than if you were to glob on a full thickness base paint and have to wait for that to dry. For starting our Stormcast, we're going to want to base out all of the armor on the model in our Retributor armor, which is the gold metallic paint. Before you crack open the paint, you need remember to shake it, shake the ever-loving crap out of it to make sure that all the pigment is mixed into it, so sometimes you can see like where there's noticeable layers. All acrylics have a tendency to settle out over time. That's just the nature of the beast. Metallic paints are a little bit more prone to it, so they need a little bit more shaking. But basically, any paint, you should probably shake it before you start using it. We're wanting to paint all the armor areas in the model, the shield, and some of the fittings on the spear. Since this is the first color that we're putting down, we don't have to worry too much about any overages while we're doing this. Just focusing on getting it down quickly and making sure that we have complete coverage of all the areas that we want to be gold, because we can clean it up afterwards. If you thinned your paint down sufficiently, you're probably going to need to apply a second layer, as I mentioned before, just to clean up any thin sections where the gray is showing through from underneath. This is what my model looks like with the gold paint on and dried, so you can see what I painted. I probably didn't need to paint as much of the pauldrons and the shield as I did, since I'm almost immediately going to paint those areas blue, but I just kind of wanted to make sure everything that I wanted to be gold, like there was no little gaps. You can pause the video now and go paint the gold areas of your model. The next color we're going to be painting on our model is the blue, which will be Cantor blue, which tends to be a bit thick out of the pot, like thicker than most base paints in my experience. So you're definitely going to want to thin this before using it. With this, we're going to be painting the pauldrons, the face of the shield, and the grip of the spear. For the raised emblems on the shoulders and the shield, they're going to be white later on the model. I'm not being particularly careful about avoiding them at this point, since they're going to need to be painted over anyway. So like basically any time spent avoiding painting those areas is just slowing me down, since I have to paint over them anyway. Since we don't have any browns or blacks in this kit, I'm also using this blue paint to paint the strap on the back side of the shield. For the other leathers, like the belt and the pouch, you could use the blue also there. I'm going to be demonstrating a different painting technique to get a leather effect there using the paints that we have. But, you know, you could do blue if you prefer. I also painted the scabbard blue just to tie it in to the leather of the spear grip. For the areas that you're painting Cantor blue, where you're painting over some gold paint, definitely make sure to get multiple layers down to get complete coverage, since slightly thin Cantor blue over gold tends to have this kind of like sickly green cast, which is just really nasty looking at times. This is how my model looks after I have all the Cantor blue on it. You should pause now and go paint some blue on your model. The next step that we're going to be doing is all the white details on the model using Corax White. Corax White is unfortunately a very poor quality paint. I would normally recommend just using pretty much any other white, either from GW or another company's instead of it. But yeah, I guess that's what we're going to have to deal with here. For this pot, you're probably going to wear out your shoulder shaking it, since this paint does have a tendency to go chunky, just because we could get into a whole bunch of theory of pigments and how paints are made, but basically the pigment in this can't be ground as fine as others, so it has a tendency to clump up, and it's really nasty. You may honestly just have to add a little bit of water to the pot if it's just too thick, like to get a good shake going. For consistency on the palette, you're going to want to thin this down a little bit more than some of the other colors, and you'll just have to lay down a few more layers, because as I mentioned, this pigment, because it's a little bit coarser ground, tends to be makes the paint a little bit thicker and harder to work with, so you need to put a little bit more water in it. Yeah, so because it's going to be a little bit wetter, just make sure after you put some on your brush to wipe off any excess on like a piece of paper towel or something, just so you don't have a fully sopping wet brush while you're working. For these raised details, I recommend coating the entire center ridge of the side with the side of your brush. So like all of these have kind of like a point, like a ridge down the center of it. So you want to slide the brush with a gentle touch along the side just to paint that to begin with. And then you're going to want to switch over to working more at the point to slowly work down the sides of the raised area to get complete coverage with control. If you spill out into the surrounding blue or gold areas, that's fine. You can use those paints to go clean this up later afterwards. We just want, as always, want to make sure that we get good coverage over the area that we're currently doing. In addition to the clearly white areas from the picture or the box, I'm going to be painting some of the leather, as I mentioned before, like the belts and the pouch using this white. These areas are going to be shaded multiple times later to get a worn leather effect, just so you know where we're going with that. I also painted any stone elements with this white because, yeah, we just don't have anything else better to paint with. I would honestly consider just cutting off the stone elements if you don't have a better paint to use. So here's what my model looks like with all the white elements base coated. You can pause the video now and go paint some finicky white details on your model. Now we have the last main color to block out on our model, which is the steel metallic, which is going to be our lead belcher. This is going to be used primarily for the blade of the spear, some parts of the fittings of the spear, and the scales of the skirt. If you're feeling fancy, this can also be used to do things like the belt buckle and the handle of the shield and some attachment points also. After finishing painting this lead belcher on your model, you're going to want to spend some time cleaning up any overages or blown out areas that you have. This is because the next step we're going to be doing is shading the model. So any base coat issues that you have need to be corrected now, because once we put the shade on, you're going to have to base coat and shade to fix any of those. So just get everything nice cleaned at this point. This is how my model looks after we get the lead belcher done and I've done some cleanup. You should pause the video now and go paint out the steel areas of your model. Now that we have all of our base coats done on the main parts of the model, we're going to move on to shading it. This involves applying a thin, watery paint to the entire model that's going to sink into the recesses of the model and just generally darken those areas that look like they're in shadow. This will increase the overall contrast of our model by darkening things, and it really helps define details and pick out shapes nicely. The shade that we're going to be using today is Agrix Earth Shade, which is a dark brown wash. The color is basically an umber. If you're looking at other brands, they'll call it that. The process for this is to basically slop it on a section of your model and then use the brush to spread it out to cover a wide area thinly. You're going to want to avoid the shade gathering any significant pools. If this starts occurring, you can use your brush to move the paint out of the pool. If you're finding there's just too much liquid in an area, like on the front of the shield or somewhere where it's pooling really badly and there's nowhere to move it, clean out your brush and then use the unloaded brush to wick away the excess paint. Though we're using Agrix Earth Shade here, there's a number of other colors of washes available. So if you have a wider collection of paints, you might instead choose to use something like Nuln Oil, which is a black wash for the steel elements to shadow them. After applying your shade paint, you're going to want to let it sit fully dry before proceeding, which can take a little bit longer than other paints we've applied. So you might want to go have a cup of coffee or watch one of my other videos while you wait. For the leather elements on the belt and pouch that I based out using Corax White, but we want to have like a brown color to them, I ended up applying 3 or 4 coats of Agrix Earth Shade to get the final worn leather effect. So that's basically the trick there, is we're just going to shade it multiple times to get our leather effect. This is how my model looks after all the shade is dried on it. You can pause the video now and go shade your model. For getting a model to meet the like a tournament 3-color rule, this paint job is technically sufficient at this point. But I really don't like leaving models at this stage because they feel really incomplete to me. They feel like they're partway through the process, which it kind of is. But with some simple techniques and a little bit more work, I think we can get results that are substantially better than what we currently have. The major issue that we have with this model currently is the fact that all that Agrix Earthshade has dirtied it up noticeably. It has darkened the shadows how we wanted, but any like large open surfaces or things that are more in the sun, or it got stained a bit too, so they kind of look a little bit grimy. Very careful application of shade paint could have avoided this, but that's precise and finicky, and it makes things more time consuming. Basically, I'd rather do 2 things quickly, do something and fix it, than spend 3 times as long making it right the first time, because nobody got time for finicky detail painting. So instead, we're just going to be cleaning up all those dirty areas after the fact. The first area that we're going to be cleaning up is the Corax White areas on the shield and shoulders. Those are the ones that we want to read white in the end, so like the little face bits and like the thunderbolts, or lightning bolts, I guess. Not thunder, because you can't hear models. unless of course they're old school metal ones that you're bending back the shape and they make that frightening crinkling sound. For the actually cleaning up this white, we're going to be using our thin down Corax white again, dabbing off any excess from my brush. And basically I'm going to be doing the same side of the brush technique that we started out with before on the ridges to get the raised elements. But instead, unlike last time, I'm not going to be doing the point work to fill in the sides. Instead, leaving the sides a little bit darker so that we maintain a more defined shape. For the armor, we're going to be going through a similar process, just using Retributor armor, focusing on highlighting any hard edges that might like basically corners and things like that. But we're also going to be cleaning up any of the big surface plates, like on the chest and the back, if they're looking a little bit grimy, just getting a little bit of paint in there to bring it back up. You want to avoid getting any paint down into the recesses of the armor, but if you do, it's not the end of the world. Just let it dry, and then drop a little bit extra shade into the crease and to get it back down. Another consideration you should have when you're doing this highlighting is where your light source is. Since some of the elements of the model are not going to be in direct sunlight, so should be darker than other ones, and the shade may not exactly reflect that. The simplest lighting one can do is assumes the sun from above that has a bit, and it's relatively diffuse. This means that the majority of our highlights should be focused on the top of the model and the side and any edges that are facing upwards. Since we're dealing with a diffuse light source and we're not trying to achieve like a dramatic OSL type effect, there's also going to be some highlights on the sides of the models, i.e. the areas that are running perpendicular to the ground. Bottoms of arms and legs and stuff should be in shadow, so the highlights used highlights should be used sparingly on the underside of things. Basically only like really hard edges, or if there's like noticeably pooled shade that you need to clean up. Once we have the gold metallic done, we're going to highlight our blue areas. For the shoulders, I did a pseudo directional light thing as I described before, trying to brightening up the tops a little bit more than doing the sides, but with such a small area and only one color, there's really limited to how much you can achieve here. On the shield, I mostly cleaned up the blue so it didn't read as dirty, though I did leave a little bit like down in the bottom of the point shaded so that you get a little bit more depth there. I didn't really highlight the blue leather regions at all because I want them to read as darker. And the final color that we have to clean up is our lead belcher. For the spear blade, I used the side of the brush to brighten up the edge of the blade and the raised fuller of it. And then I did some very light overbrushing on the flat regions of the blade to give it some texture. Overbrushing is just lightly painting with most of the paint removed from your brush. For the scale, I just did basically dipped a little bit of paint, rubbed most of it off, and did a gentle overbrush there just to brighten them up towards their edges. And with all that highlighting done, this is what my model looks like. You can pause now and go do the highlighting for your model. Now that we have the body of the model done, we just need the texture base to consider it done. We're going to be using our texture paste here, Sterling Mud, for this. You're going to want to use some sort of firm spreading tool for this. I'm using my favorite metallic sculpting tool. You can fashion something out of a straw or a popsicle stick in a pinch if you need to. GW does sell a texture tool that looks like it gets the job done, but I already have sculpting tools, so I don't own one. I recommend not using a brush you care about for this, since the texture paste will tend to get into the ferrule and ruin bristles, and just, yeah, it's not good for brushes that you have any intention to use later. You're wanting to apply a blob of this texture paste to the base away from the model to avoid getting it on any of your nice clean paint job you just did, and then use your tool to push it and spread it out from there, pushing it carefully towards like the feet and such on the base. As it dries, the shapes become more defined, though I've probably laid it on a little bit too thick here to begin with, since I did actually remove some before this finished drying. Once you have it spread out, you can pat it with your tool to create ridges and make it a little bit less uniform so it doesn't look like someone just put spackle on a base. After it's all applied, you can use your thumb or a wet piece of paper towel to remove any excess from the rim of your base that kind of spilled over. If any of this dries on, you can just use your hobby knife to lightly scrape it off later if you need to, or paint over it with a black or something. Depending on how humid / warm it is where you are, it can take as little as a half hour for this stuff to dry, or upwards to a couple hours. I normally just apply this at the end of a painting session and let it dry overnight or whatever, and it'll be ready for the next time. You can pause now and go apply the texture paste to your model. We're nearly done. We just have one last step using the paints from this kit. For our base, we're going to be shading it using Agar Circle Shade so that we can get some variance in the color. Without this, you're probably going to see that the Sterling Mud is very flat looking, even though it is textured. You just want to shade it in so that you can see some of those details. Just kind of do the same way that you would do it on your model. You can run it a little bit all over the feet if you want to give them a slightly muddy look and integrate it together a little bit. That's not really essential. And like with the shading before, this is going to take some time to dry. You definitely want to make sure the texture paste is dry first, because applying a shade onto wet texture paste just kind of makes a giant mess. You should pause the video now and go shade your base. At this point, you've completed your model to a solid battle-ready standard using only the components that appear in this kit, and it should look something like this. If you have access to the paints from the Gut Ripper and paint sets or the Tools and Paint set, there's a few more refinements that we can do that I'm going to discuss. The first, which is probably the simplest, is if you have access to Steel Age and Drab, you can use that to highlight the texture of your base. This is done using a basic dry brushing. Dry brushing is very similar to overbrushing. Yeah, basically, dry brushing, you're going to get a small amount on a brush. Again, one that you probably don't care too much about because this is a little bit abusive to brushes. Wipe most of it off on a paper towel so that when you lightly stroke it on like the back of your thumb or the paper towel, it's only depositing in the hires, not down in the creases. And then gently stroke this back and forth across the base, just catching the high points and ridges to make them stand out. So you're increasing the brightness of those areas relative to the dark areas so that, again, getting more detail. You can dry brush a bit of this on the feet to give and make them look slightly dirty, like they've been walking on this train, again, integrating it better. Depending on how you like to finish your bases, you can use Steel Age and Drab to color the rim. I'm personally more of a black rim guy when it comes to modern models, so I use Abaddon Black from the Tools and Paint set to clean up the rim. For the leather areas on your model, like the haft of the spear, the belts, the straps, all that, you could use Steel Age and Drab or Rhinox Hide if you have them from the kits, instead of the brown shading that we did, or using blue. I personally would lean towards Rhinox Hide since it's a little bit darker. Abaddon Black is also often used for the straps on Stormcast. It's quite common. You can also use this black for coloring the Under Armour areas that peeks through, like on the inside of the elbows, the backs of the knees, and the armpits to differentiate. All these refinements aren't strictly necessary. They're just ways to take your model to the next level, or like kind of where you can look at, like when you're looking at it on the box, these are the types of things that people are doing to make it look a little bit more real. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video informative and enjoyable. If you did, please give the video a like. If you want to see more content like this on painting miniatures and hobbying in general, please subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for a way to support the channel in a more material manner, I can accept money over on Coffee. And other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.